Good day, philosophers. In our second video here, we're continuing to look at the nature of philosophy itself. And in this video here, we're gonna think about the various types of philosophical questions that we'll try to address as philosophers, the kinds of questions that make up wisdom, and secondly, we'll develop ultimately a philosophical vocabulary so that we can use the same words when we're talking about those kinds of questions. Okay, so let's start to look here. Let's talk about where we left off last video, right? We asked the question, what is philosophy? And we saw that quite literally the word philosophy, coming from Greek, means the love of wisdom, right? And we reflected for a while about what that meant. And I sort of gave this definition as a culmination, that it's this rigorous inquiry into the questions and beliefs that forms one's understanding of everything. Because wisdom at its heart is this desire to know and understand the things that matter the most in life. And for us, that desire to gain wisdom, is this love of wisdom, is one that will cause us to rigorously go outside of ourselves, not to be satisfied with fake wisdom, but to only be satisfied if we have the truth and the reality of the things, right? And so in this particular lecture, right, in this little section, we're going to look at what are these philosophical questions that matter to people who care about wisdom? What are the real questions that we're concerned in answering that form our belief and our understanding of everything? And so that's what we're going to kind of look at here. So let's squeak back to here. So this first set of questions, and really along the way, this is like a philosophical vocabulary. These are all words. If you're just thinking about how to practically do well in this class, you need to make sure you get down what these words mean and are able to use them, right? So in our first bunch of words here, these things all fall under what we'll call axiology. Now, what the heck is axiology? I won't tell you till after we talk about these sort of three main sub-questions that fall under axiology, okay? So the first thing that falls under axiology is one of the very first things that people think about when they start doing philosophy. This is one of the great entrance points into philosophy, and that's what we'll call ethics, right? So what's ethics? Well, when people talk about ethics, they're thinking about what's the right thing to do, what's right and wrong and stuff like that. And all of that is absolutely ethics. But I would say that ethics begins with something very fundamental. This question of what should I do? What should I do, right? And so ethics is how we answer the question, what I should do. How do I know what I should do? What is the right thing to do? How do we think clearly about that kind of stuff? Now, that matters to us because all of us do things. Do you agree? Everyone here does stuff. Right now, you watching this video is a doing of something. So you had to, at some point, think about what should I do now? I should watch this philosophy lecture. And why should I do it? Well, thinking about that question of why I should do it is ultimately connected to ethics, connected to myself. Now, connected to philosophy too or axiology is something called politics. Now, politics ultimately might not seem like philosophy at all, the way we encounter it in our current state and society. I can be very cynical about the nature of politics and how things are these days. But politics ultimately is very philosophical because it takes this sort of ethical question. It's deeply connected to ethics, but it extends it further. It says, what should we do as a community? What should we do? So when we think about what we should do, we realize that there's actually a larger group to think about. So here I am as an individual thinking about what I do by myself and my own goals and my own actions and my own ends, right? But then I also realize that I am within this community of a bunch of people. And we're not just a bunch of individuals who are only seeking our own ends, only seeking to achieve our own goals, but we actually can do and achieve things together as a community. There's things that are accomplished by a community that aren't just accomplished by individuals. And so we need to understand, for instance, a very important political question in philosophy. Political philosophy is just thinking about even what's the best form of government, right? The best form of government ought to be the kind of government that allows a community to achieve its kinds of ends. And how we govern groups is not always the same. It's dependent on the nature of the group and the end and purpose. So in some ways, we could think about our political community, and so our towns and cities and countries, but we might think of teams. Teams are also political in nature. You might think of what's the best way to organize a soccer team or a football team or a basketball team. And they might not all have the best kind of organizations, right? All have the same kind of organization that would best serve your goals. And so there's actually different things for us to think about when we're thinking about what's the good of a community? So what should we do as a community to accomplish a good end? And ethics, what should I do as an individual to accomplish whatever kind of good end we have? Now, the last kind of question that falls under this guy here, let me go back to this, is what we will call aesthetics. Now, aesthetics, that might be a word that you're not familiar with. What are we talking about when we're talking about aesthetics? Well, aesthetics has to do, you might have used the phrase whether something is aesthetically pleasing. What does it mean for something to be aesthetically pleasing? It looks good. But in a deeper sense, you might call what's aesthetic what's beautiful. And so in this sense, we could talk about beauty, right? What is beauty? And we're going to talk about beauty a lot in this course when we get into Plato. We're not going to study aesthetics as deeply as I would like to study it in some ways. We don't have time for that. But this question of what is beauty is very important. Now, let's reflect for a second. What connects all of these things? Ethics, politics, and aesthetics is falling under the same category. In some sense, they all have to do with what is good, right? What is ultimately good? What is valued, right? Now, what is valued to me is not the best way of thinking about what's good, because of course, what is valued is ultimately dependent and varies upon individuals, and what is good for a community is ultimately dependent upon various communities and things like that. And what's beautiful, we might argue, is definitely dependent upon what's valued by a bunch of different folks. But in a philosophical sense, we're also going to cut across to the very nature of what these things are and try to find the common ground about what makes beauty. And it's ultimately connected to say what's good, what makes something ethical, and what makes something ultimately politically good is all connected here in the axiologies. Axiology has to do with what's good. Now, just to take a quick second, I just want to reflect on this concept of beauty and how it falls under what's good. Because you might say like, well, maybe beauty is good to look at, but let's think about what beauty is. What do we mean by the word beautiful? What if we were to go and take a look at like in one of the previous videos, you can take a look back. You could see a picture of my family. You might see a picture of my wife, and let's just think about what beauty would mean. Say you were talking about my wife. So say you saw that video and someone sent me a message and said, "Hey, Professor Zach, you just wanted you to know your wife is beautiful." How would I react to that? Well, actually, it'd be kind of weird if you sent me a message, but if it was in class or something like that and said, "Hey, Mr." Because it seems like you're going out of your way. If you send me a message, tell me my wife is beautiful. Like, what are you doing, going out of your way, telling me that? It's a little strange. But if we were just like together and you saw a picture, like, wow, your wife is beautiful. Well, what would I think? I'd be like, yeah, she is. I'm glad you noticed, right? She is beautiful. But what if you said something like this? What if instead of saying, "Hey, Professor Zach, your wife is beautiful," you said, "Hey, Professor Zach, your wife's hot." My wife's hot. How would I react to that? I would not be so happy, right? Because beauty is not the same thing as just being hot. That goes back to the discussion we had in our last video about a love of service, a love of adoration, and a love of possession, right? If you said that my wife is hot, then what I'm thinking is that you're thinking more of the love of possession than you're thinking of the love of adoration and the love of service. And so when we think about beauty in a deeper sense, we're really thinking about adoration, about acknowledging something in its goodness, right? And the beauty of a thing, notice that here I have in some of these images here that these are supposed to be different images of beautiful things, of things that are worth doing by an individual and things that are ultimately good, right? We have like a surfer here, right? And that's awesome. That is beautiful. But we also have this sort of this act right here that you could see this person doing a good deed for someone maybe down on their luck. I don't know. And that's also beautiful. That even when we think about ethics, part of what makes the ethical thing the good thing or the right thing to do often has to do with its connection to beauty as well. And so understanding beauty is ultimately a great way to help us understand what's ultimately good ethically and good politically. It's all part of our philosophical question. So these are things that we're going to care about in philosophy. What else do we care about in philosophy? What other kinds of questions? Well, let's go now to this next phrase, epistemology. Now, epistemology is a big word. You might not have heard it before. Epistemology goes back to a Greek word, episteme, right? And so if we're looking at the word episteme means in some ways science, right? In a broader sense than the way we use the word science in our common day, when we think of science, we think of natural sciences. But what does science claim to do? It claims to know about things, right? It has to do with actually grasping the truth of something, right? And so epistemology ultimately asks this question about what it means to know something, right? And connected to what it means to know, it's ultimately trying to understand what's true. Right? So that's when we take up epistemological questions, we're going to raise the questions about what we can know, what it means to know, and what's really true in and of itself. Okay? Now, another type of, and we'll reflect on this more, another type of philosophical question we'll call metaphysics. Now, metaphysics, you could break it down at what it means like beyond physics. In some ways it does, but metaphysics fundamentally gets to what it means to exist, existence itself. It gets to what is fundamentally real, what is reality itself. And we start raising metaphysical questions, or we analyze something metaphysically. We're trying to get to kind of like the nature of what something is in its nature. What makes the thing what it is? What is the reality of the thing? What is the being of the thing? Trying to understand existence and reality, right? And so notice there was like this ratcheting up of the abstractness of these philosophical questions, and you might call the depth of these questions, right? We started with something that actually is kind of close and true to life, right? And so oftentimes, when we're first starting to do philosophy, we'll start with something like ethics, right? Because ethics has to do with what? Actions. And politics has to do with actions and things like that. It has to do with these direct experiences here. So, but let's think about this. Let's say we look at the world today. We've got a lot of interesting issues coming up. So let's say that I've heard many folks say this: we want justice. We want justice for our society. We want justice for our communities. We want justice for our children. We need justice, right? And I agree that we do. So let's think about this, though. If we say we want justice, we need justice, and we look at a particular action and we say that that law is an unjust law, or that choice that person made is an unjust choice, that we don't have justice, that is an example of injustice in our world. Well, then the next deeper question is, okay, if we want justice, we might raise the question, what is justice? What the heck is justice anyways, right? And if I want to know what justice is, I might then have to ask, what does it mean to know? How could we even know anything about justice, right? I mean, how could we gain knowledge about justice, right? That says, what does it mean to know? I'm sorry, my handwriting is kind of trash right there. I apologize. What does it mean to know? What does it even mean to know something? But then, like, what is justice in a metaphysical sense? Like, where is it? Where do we look for justice, right? So where can you find it, right? Is justice something now, like someone like Plato, as we study Plato, he's going to say that justice has a kind of universal essence or nature or definition, and that's something that we'll have to try to grasp philosophically. But where do we look for justice? What is the reality of the thing? Similar to this too, like we might say, like, oh, connected to justice, we need to have human rights. Well, if we need to have human rights, how do you know what the human rights are? How do you even know what anything is? What does it even mean to be a human, that a human would have rights? So we have this motion from this ethical concern that we need to have respect for human rights, to this epistemological concern with what it even means to know in general, to this metaphysical notion about the nature of the human being itself and what would give a human being rights by nature, right? This is the path of philosophy, where we'll see that questions lead into each other. Now, let's say we gave a metaphysical answer, and this is going to be a big, interesting problem. How do we know what the nature of a human being is? We'll encounter some people that argue that ultimately there is no ground for the nature of a human being, that a human being simply is what it is based on our choice, that we choose the definition of a human being. But if we simply just choose the definition of a human being, is that a fundamental ground for human rights? If the human being is just whatever we choose it to be, then is there such thing as a kind of universal right to anything? Or is it all just arbitrarily also something that's given by a community, right? There's consequences to our metaphysical determinations about the nature of things as well, too. And so all of this is going to get connected, right? And so when we study particular philosophers in this course, we're going to find that these three main questions are the most important for us. These axiological questions, for us in particular, we're going to start with ethics, right? We're going to, no matter what philosopher we study, we're going to try to look at what are their ethical positions. We're also going to look at their epistemological views about what it means to know, epistemology, and then finally their metaphysical views. Now, of course, again, that ethics aspect really fell under axiology, which was just really, and ethics was just one small branch of it. There was the political end and the aesthetic end, but the political and aesthetic end is not always as evident in people. So at the very least, we're going to say we're going to look at the ethics of philosophers. We're going to look at their epistemology and look at their metaphysics, and that will be sort of the fundamental kinds of questions that these philosophers are going to raise and that we're going to try to engage with, right? And so there you go. These are those main philosophical questions that we'll engage in our course. Have a beautiful day, and I'll catch you on the flip side.